They said the strangest things hide in plain sight, and on that cool morning at the Naval Amphibious Base, I learned just how true that was when a quiet young woman walked into a room full of warriors who had no idea who they were looking at, but should have. If you believe that respect should never be determined by appearances, make sure to like and subscribe, because this is one of those stories where assumptions crumble faster than pride. And it all started with a faded tattoo I almost didn't notice until it was too late. Lena Hartley didn't move like the usual civilian analysts who drifted through the briefing rooms with a certain timidity. She walked like someone who already knew every corner of danger a room could hold. Still, at 28, with her blonde hair pulled back and her expression calm to the point of unreadability, she blended easily into the crowd. Just another face in a world of uniforms and hardened operators. That is, until the moment she took the last seat at the long mahogany table, just as SEAL Team 9 piled in, filling the space with their trademark mix of competitive energy and reckless banter. They were loud that morning. Too loud. The kind of loud men use when they're trying to burn off nerves before an op, and I watched the way some of them glanced at Lena with mild curiosity, but nothing more. To them, she was an analyst, someone who typed in dark rooms and handed over intel packets with trembling fingers. That illusion lasted all of 5 minutes. When she set her tablet down and adjusted her papers, her sleeve slipped just enough to reveal a faded mark on her inner forearm. I didn't catch it at first. It looked like old ink, the kind of DIY tattoo someone gets at 19 and regrets later. But Petty Officer Riker caught it immediately. He leaned in, squinted, and let out a sharp laugh that cut through the room. "Well, look at that," he said loudly, pointing. "Didn't know civilians could get discount Trident tattoos." The team burst into laughter, the kind that fills a room with the smug assurance that they found something to mock. Lena didn't react. Not a twitch. Not a breath. She simply turned the page in her folder as if the room had gone quiet instead of erupting around her. Riker wasn't done. He leaned over her shoulder, wearing that crooked grin that always spelled trouble. "Where'd you get it?" he asked. "Okinawa? Vegas? Or let me guess, you got a Groupon for wannabe operator Inc.?" The SEALs cracked up again, slapping the table. One nudged another. "Hey, maybe she dated a SEAL once. That's close enough, right?" It should have bothered her. Anyone else would have flushed, snapped back, maybe melted under the weight of a half-dozen elite warriors mocking them. But Lena, she just looked up slowly, her expression unchanging, her eyes the same level, assessing calm I'd seen in men who had stared straight into the fire of real combat. "Petty Officer," she said softly, "if I were pretending, you would know." That tone. God, I hadn't heard a tone like that in years. Not defensive, not offended, not arrogant. Just something old, experienced, familiar in the way a scar is familiar. The room quieted, not completely, but the laughter dimmed into an uneasy smirk. Riker leaned back, a slight frown forming as if something in her eyes nudged at a memory he couldn't quite place. But then he recovered, shrugging as the others egged him on. "Relax," he said, waving her off. "We're just messing with you. Civilians get sensitive too easy." Lena returned her attention to her folder. Not a sigh, not a reaction, nothing. And that, oddly enough, bothered the room more than her fighting back would have. You could feel the shift in the air, the strange tension that comes when men expect a reaction and are denied one. Meanwhile, I found myself staring at the tattoo. Now that I was closer, I saw it wasn't just a trident. It had a dagger crossing behind it, and something else. Numbers, maybe? A date? No. Coordinates? Whatever it wasn't decorative. It wasn't trendy. It was a mark born of something real. Something earned. Before I could lean in for a better look, the door swung open with a sharp metallic click that snapped every operator in the room to rigid attention. Rear Admiral Jonathan Keene entered, one of the most decorated men in naval special warfare, the kind of leader whose presence alone shifts a room's gravity. Conversations died. Chairs straightened. Voices shut off mid-laugh. But the strangest thing? Lena didn't jump to attention. She stood, yes, respectful, composed, but there was no scrambling, no nervous fumbling. She moved like someone who had greeted admirals before, not like an analyst, but like a peer. The admiral swept the room with his gaze before it landed on her, and in that moment, the entire atmosphere collapsed in on itself. His expression changed, only slightly, but enough for me to feel the world tilt. His eyes widened, just a fraction. His breath hitched, barely perceptible. And then he said a name I never expected to hear come out of the mouth of a man like him. Hartley. The room froze. Even Riker, halfway through a smirk, went still. Lena nodded once. "Good morning, sir." Silence hit the room like a fist. The admiral took a slow step toward her, not toward his officers, not toward the team commander, but toward the woman they had just finished laughing at. Something inside me whispered that everything I thought I knew about her was wrong. Very wrong. Because in all my years on bases, I had never seen Admiral Keen look at anyone. Not SEAL, not Marine, not officer, with recognition like that. And certainly not with awe. That was the moment I realized her faded tattoo wasn't a joke. It was a warning, and every man laughing had just crossed a line they didn't yet understand. But they would, very soon. The room held its breath as Admiral Keen approached Lena with the kind of deliberate steps reserved for moments that alter the soil beneath people's feet, and I could see the SEALs around the table straightening, recalibrating, struggling to reconcile what they were witnessing. The Admiral wasn't a man who displayed surprise lightly, yet here he was, eyes locked onto the young woman they had mocked minutes earlier, as though he were staring at the ghost of someone he once knew in another lifetime. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, voice lower than usual, carrying an undertone I couldn't fully decipher. Was it respect? Disbelief? Something bordering on relief? Lena merely replied, "I was reassigned last month, sir," as if the tension in the room hadn't doubled in weight with every passing second. Riker shifted uncomfortably, and I could tell he was trying to piece together why the Rear Admiral of Naval Special Warfare would speak to a civilian analyst like she was a decorated veteran. Before anyone could ask, Admiral Keen reached out and gently took her wrist, lifting her arm so the faded ink caught the overhead light. Then, without hesitation, he rolled up his own sleeve. What I saw next erased every shred of doubt, every whisper of assumption, every careless joke the SEALs had thrown at her. Because etched into the Admiral's forearm, older, harsher, marked by time, was the exact same tattoo. Not similar, not inspired by. Identical, down to the precise angle of the dagger and the faint outline of an old coordinate string beneath it. A ripple of shock spread through the room like a silent explosion. The Admiral looked around the table slowly, letting the significance settle into each stunned operator. "You all seem confused," he said, voice steady, authoritative. "Allow me to clear that up. This mark," he lifted their arms side by side, "belongs to Strike Element Echo." I heard the collective intake of breath from men who knew that name well. An elite, short-lived, classified rescue element formed during Operation Iron Tide, a mission whispered about across special operations, but rarely discussed openly. "There were only 11 of us," the Admiral continued. 6 SEALs. For Marines. He looked at Lena, and something in his expression softened in a way I had never seen from him. "And 1 intelligence specialist who should never have survived what we walked into." Laughter evaporated from the room entirely. Riker looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. "Hartley joined us at 20, the Admiral said, addressing the room but never taking his eyes off her. "Too young, too small, too quiet." Then, with a low exhale, "and tougher than half the men I've commanded." You could have heard a pin drop. When the safe house collapsed, he went on, everyone inside was deemed Kia. Extraction was denied. The order was to abandon the site. A few SEALs exchanged uneasy looks. Abandoning teammates was sacrilege in their world. But Hartley ignored the order, he said, pride and gravity mingling in his words. She went back in alone. Twice, she dug men out with her bare hands, dragged our comms chief through dust and fire while her shoulder was shattered and her face was bleeding so badly we thought she'd lose sight in one eye. He paused. "She saved my life. I was the last one she carried out." Riker's mouth fell open. Someone else muttered, "Holy hell," under his breath. Lena stood perfectly still, posture steady, face unreadable, as though the memories he spoke of belonged to a stranger she once knew but no longer needed to be. "We offered her a permanent place with us afterward," the Admiral said quietly, but she declined. His gaze softened, even warmed. Said she preferred to work in the shadows. He released her wrist, then, slowly, almost reluctantly, as if placing something sacred back into its rightful place. The SEALs shifted in their seats, Their earlier bravado evaporated, replaced by something deeper, respect tinged with a hint of shame. Lena didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even look at the man who had mocked her moments earlier. She simply nodded to the admiral and returned to her seat, her presence now radiating a different kind of gravity, one born from having walked through fire and come back marked, yet unbroken. And for the first time since she'd entered the room, not a single man dared to underestimate her again. The briefing dissolved slowly, like fog lifting after a storm, and I remember thinking that I had never seen a SEAL team so hesitant to leave a room before. Their movements lacked the usual confident stride, the casual camaraderie that normally carried them from one mission to the next without pause. Instead, they hovered, silent, contemplative, processing the revelation that the young woman they'd mocked for her faded tattoo had once been the sole thread holding together an entire task force on the brink of death. Lena gathered her notes with the same quiet focus she'd walked in with, but there was a subtle shift in the air around her, a widening circle of respect that grew with every second the men stood there, unsure of how to approach her now that they understood exactly who she was. Riker was the first to attempt it, though his bravado had evaporated entirely. He stepped forward slowly, almost sheepishly, stopping a good foot away as if afraid to encroach on something sacred. "Ma'am," he finally managed, the word rough and unpolished on his tongue. "I didn't know, and I shouldn't have said any of that. I'm sorry." She looked at him with the same calm composure she had shown all morning and gave a small, understanding nod, not forgiving the mockery, not erasing it, but acknowledging that he'd grown in the span of an hour in a way some men take years to manage. "Respect is something you give before you know someone's story," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, and the line hit the room like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward into every watching face. The tension that had wrapped around Riker's shoulders loosened slightly. He exhaled and nodded back, humbled in a way only truth can humble a man. As the others formed a quiet, loose semicircle around her, murmuring their own belated acknowledgments and regrets, Admiral Keen stepped forward, placing a steady hand on her shoulder with a familiarity that spoke of shared fire and shared ghosts. "Hartley," he said, "walk with me." She followed him through the hallway lined with decades of SEAL insignias, framed mission photos, and plaques honoring fallen heroes. And though she didn't break stride, I noticed the weight of the moment settling into her posture. Tiny, almost invisible tells in the tilt of her shoulders and the way her grit tightened on the folder she carried. The Admiral's office was a space I'd only ever seen from afar, a place few entered without invitation, and when he closed the door quietly behind them, it felt as though the entire base held its breath, waiting. Inside, he moved to his desk, opened a drawer I didn't even know existed, and pulled out an old, battered Steel Challenge coin. It was heavier than most coins of its kind, both in metal and meaning, its edges dented, its emblem worn by time, the trident and dagger insignia dulled but unmistakable, the same one carved into their arms. He set it gently on the desk between them. "We minted these after Iron Tide," he said, his voice lower now, carrying a depth that only comes when revisiting memories stitched together with equal parts pride and pain. Each member of Strike Element Echo got one, but this last one, I held on to it. Thought I'd give it to the man who saved my life. He paused, but I was wrong. It belongs to the person who went back in. Lena stood still, the emotion in her eyes subtle but undeniably there. A flicker of something old resurfacing, of nights spent replaying moments buried under rubble and fire and adrenaline, of the screams, dust, chaos, and impossible courage she never spoke of anymore. "Sir," she said quietly, "I don't need recognition." Admiral Keen shook his head. "This isn't about recognition," he replied. "It's about truth. And truth is rarely convenient, but it always matters." After a long second, she reached out and closed her hand around the coin, her fingers curling around its cool metal like she was reclaiming a part of herself she'd left behind. Years ago, when they stepped back into the hallway, the shift in the atmosphere was unmistakable. The operators who had lingered nearby straightened automatically. Not in fear, not out of protocol, but out of a reverence they couldn't articulate. They didn't salute her, didn't snap to attention, but the room tilted subtly in her direction, The way people unconsciously respond to someone who has seen the worst of the world and walked out carrying the weight so gracefully, it becomes a kind of silent armor. Lena didn't seek their attention. She simply nodded once, passing them with the quiet strength of someone who had no need to prove anything anymore. Outside, the sun was beginning to bleed into late afternoon gold, casting warm light across the concrete expanse of the base. She paused at the exit, momentarily caught in that glow, the steel coin in her hand reflecting a faint shimmer, like embers from an old fire refusing to die out. In that moment, she didn't look like a civilian intel analyst or a forgotten field operative or the woman they had underestimated the moment she walked in. She looked like someone who had been shaped by both loss and survival, who had bled on foreign soil and learned to rebuild herself without applause or acknowledgement, who carried her past not as a burden, but as a quiet, unyielding foundation. And though the SEALs returned to their routines, though laughter eventually crept back into the hallways and missions resumed as they always did, something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. They would remember her. They would tell her story in low voices during late-night watch rotations. They would recognize bravery in forms they hadn't bothered to look for before. And they would never again mistake silence for weakness, or softness for fragility, or a faded tattoo for anything less than a lifetime of battles survived. Lena Hartley entered their world a stranger, and left it as a legend whispered with the kind of respect earned only by the rare few who walk into hell twice, and come back carrying the ones who couldn't walk out themselves.